What caused the Vietnam War? The causes of Vietnam War revolved around a simple belief held by America that communism was threatening to expand all over Southeast Asia.
At that time, every male, upon your 18th birthday, had to register with the Selective Service. And the Selective Service was better known as the draft. And so you would apply, and you get an initial card, a draft card, which I put away someplace, but I still have it. And then at some point, you would possibly be called. And the first part of the process is if you got a call, you were sent to a local induction center, as they were called, for a draft physical. And in the case of mine, I was a senior in college. It was during finals when part of my own making, because I stopped taking student deferments. And so I went to Oakland to go through well, I had to drive to San Jose because I was registered in San Jose. And then I got on a bus. They were a Trailway, not even a Greyhound. And they'd take you up and drop you off at the induction center. And then you spent the day there going through the draft physical. By that time, this is beginning of 71. There had been so much chaos and so much disruptions at the Oakland Induction Center that it was a weird experience.
On November 26, 1969, President Nixon signed an amendment to the Military Selective Service Act of 1967 that established random selection. The order of call for induction was determined by their birth date.
Okay. There were a couple of draft systems. One, like my brother is 17 years older than I. And so at his time, which was really kind of the Korean War, almost everybody was drafted based on your local draft board. And the rumors always were that if you had connections, your number never popped up. If you didn't have connections, then your number came up. Eventually, it must have been late 69 or early 70, they decided to give everybody in the draft pool a number based on your birth date so that things would be fair.
During the war, a lot of people got drafted, but there are also people who tried to avoid the draft by using underground railroads through Canada.
I didn't. I knew people that did. So when I applied for the conscientious objector status, they scheduled a meeting. I had to turn in paperwork. I had to write a letter for the reasons. I had to find 2 letters of support. And then in a very tiny room in a building off First Street in downtown San Jose, up 2 flights of stairs, I waited in the lobby until they called me, and I walked in, and there was a table probably twice the size of this one, and almost no room behind, and 2 giant flags, California flag, US flag, and I was in there for 45 minutes, and they peppered me with questions. And one of the questions they said, well, you try to go to Canada or Sweden. And I said, no, I only applied because I had come to grips with the idea that I would go to jail. I would not run.
For the people who had the CO status had to perform alternative services, and those services have to be accepted by the draft board and also helpful to society.
Well, that was sort of a strange experience. They sent me, a letter that I was now drafted. I had 6 weeks to find alternative service. So I had to find something that they would accept, the draft board, and it couldn't be on anything I had any interest in. And it had to be kind of helpful to society sort of thing. And I ended up getting a job at French Hospital, which no longer exists, in San Francisco. And I was an orderly. So I worked in mostly moving bodies. I worked in surgery, and then eventually I ended up in the recovery room, and I would pick people up before surgery and bring them down, and then bring them to recovery, and then take them back to the rooms. And
even though there were a lot of people who got drafted in the war, There were also people who tried to avoid the draft using legal ways like deferments.
I'm not sure. There's a book which I gave away when I moved called Chance and Circumstance, and it was co-authored, and I can't remember the author's name. And it was fascinating because there were about 40 million young Americans that were in the draft pool. And then there were only about 3 to 4 million that ever got drafted. And this book went through and took out, so there were legal ways to avoid the draft. So you could take a student deferment, and then during the course of your student deferment, you could ask for a graduate deferment, which they generally granted. And then let's say at that time you got married, then you were a married person, so that gave you a different priority. And then if you had a child, you got a different priority. So many people play, I guess it was viewed sometimes as playing the system, that you were able to avoid the draft. Another way is that if you worked at a defense plant or you worked for an industry deemed crucial to the United States, such as the oil industry, then you were deferred, you weren't drafted. And so what happened in many cases is that the people with the least options in life, the people that didn't really have any contacts or any connections, those were the people that ended up almost automatically getting drafted.
The 1960 U-2 incident occurred during the Cold War on May 1, 1960, when a United States U-2 spy plane was shot down while in Soviet airspace. Initially, the United States government tried to cover up the plane's purpose and mission, but was forced to admit its military nature when the Soviet government came forward with the captured pilot and remains of the U-2, including spying technology that had survived the crash, as well as photo of military bases in the Soviet Union taken by the aircraft.
I think that kind of the long-range view to me is that things started to go apart for the United States with the U-2 flight. Because the U-2 flight was the first time we were really caught red-handed lying. You know, I mean, we may have fibbed before that and all sorts of things, but that was the one where we really got caught. And when you look back at Vietnam, you know, Robert McNamara, you know, the Hammerstead book, The Best and the Brightest, you know, that these people were all kind of done in by a view that was unattainable. That's what drove me nuts about Iraq, is that we went down the same sort of path that we had.
The Vietnam War was very different compared to World War II, because the Vietnam War was considered a bad war and World War II is considered a good war.
You take 18-year-olds, you know, you give them some basic training, you throw them out in the middle of nowhere in terms of, say, that's the enemy, but you're not really sure who the enemy is. And one of the things that I read much later, a difference between, say, World War II and probably World War I and Vietnam, is that you went as a unit. So in World War II, you trained with these 30 people, and these 30 people went off to, you know, the Pacific, or they went off to Europe, and you were together. But in Vietnam, you were like a solo person. So you were at Fort Lewis for basic, or Fort Ord on the West Coast, and you end up getting a ticket, and you fly to the Philippines, and then you get positioned there and they send you to Vietnam, and this company lost 4 people, so they take these 4 guys and send them off to that company. And these 4 guys don't know each other, and the company knows that the newer people are more likely to get killed, and they don't want to. And so you were dealt with in isolation, and then all of a sudden you had a little R&R, and then they flew you to some place, and you were in this other strange world, and boom, you're right back on the front lines.